Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Can I get a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Fantastic. So we'll move into this next bit, which is really the same as before, but just looking at a deeper dive into governance. And we'll specifically talk about independent school governance. So as we started off talking about influence, I'll give you another view of what influence might look like if you wanted to just sort of be a little bit more graphic about it. You know, that little desk toy that some of you might have. So now, if you have one of these desk toys on your desk, you will never not think of it without faces again. I can promise you, once you've seen this, you can never unsee it. And if you don't have one of those, I highly recommend that you go get one and then paint some faces on it, because it will be a lot of fun. But this is another view of influence, just another way of understanding the way that it ripples out, and really understanding your core, as Aaron has mentioned, understanding where you're coming from, how you show up authentically and engaged and ready to actively listen and participate in someone else's life, and what they're trying to accomplish. This is the type of ripple that we're really talking about. Governance is something that is that is fantastically easy in theory and unbelievably difficult in operation. I'll start off with just a few quotes here from some of my colleagues who are executive directors of different associations, in really talking about the governance and the primary relationship between the board and the head of school. Any circumstance that interrupts the head's ability to lead has a potential to disrupt normal school operations, unsettle faculty and staff, distance parents, and fracture boards. Reality for almost all school heads and their boards is that the urgent always overwhelms the important. And finally, the rash decision to fire the head halts institutional momentum and generates constituent anxiety that weakens the school. These are things that our industry has been facing for several years. The tenure of heads of school, generally speaking, has gotten a little bit shorter over the last 2 decades or so. Interestingly, when you look at the means and medians of the tenure of heads of school and tenures of CFOs, they're actually not all that different, which is something I think our industry doesn't realize. But it's just as disruptive if someone in your position, whether you're CFO, HR, wherever you are in the operational hierarchy of your school, it is incredibly disruptive to folks with as much authority, leadership, and influence as you to leave the school. So I'm going to hit some of the highlights of what governance is, what good governance looks like. I certainly will not bore you with this. I'm not joking. I can speak for hours on this, but I'm not going to bore you about that. But if you are a governance wonk like I am, we can definitely have talks later on at another time. But some data points first, different profiles of who tends to be on independent school boards. So a combination of different data sets from NAIS, from our own data set, from some work that I did when I was with SAIS, and some different research that's been conducted. So you can see, based on enrollment size of school is a normal proxy for overall school complication. It's not an exact thing, because a school with 200 students may have a $50 million budget, because it tends to be a boarding school or something like that. And a school with 700 or 1,000 students may have a $20 million budget, because they're in a rural area, they're not charging a large tuition. But generally speaking, the larger the school, the more people are serving on an independent school board. You can see the breakout, male-female breakout, is actually pretty fair, pretty balanced in schools. Now, it probably won't surprise you that there's not a lot of diversity on independent school boards. We tend to think that 14 to 15% diversity in a school population is good, and I tend to think that means that we're 85% not diverse, as just another way of thinking about it. Boards tend to follow that pattern as well, and do tend to mirror what the school looks like. So the next is, how many members of your board are current parents? Actually, it's a little bit lower. It's about 60% are current parents, but you see past parents makes up the rest of that. Generally speaking, most independent school boards throughout the Southeast tend to mostly be comprised of parents. So parents or former parents, so about 70 or 80% or so. And here's the reason this is important. Parents are engaged in day-to-day operations of a school, and they tend to see the school through the lens of their child. When you actually want board members to see the school through the lens of the entire operation. As Julie mentioned on the first day, she said, if your parents and your community are happy and your student body is happy, the board's probably going to be happy. The reason for that is there's a direct correlation, because that is the lens through which they will see the school. Next is whether they're alums or not. It's actually kind of rare. So it's only about 15-16% that are alums. And this is a broad data set. Your school, if it's a 40, 50-year-old school or so, you may have a lot of alums who are serving on your board because they're now sending their own kids to the school, and they're very invested. If your school is only 10 years old, you probably don't have alums serving on your board quite yet, but you might eventually. And then this one, educated. Board members tend to be very highly educated. They believe in school. They believe in higher ed as well. So you can see bachelor's or graduate degree plus is 80-90% of all folks who are serving on boards. And then those who work, most are working full time. The most dangerous board member is the one who doesn't have anything else to occupy their time. So here's the game that we're going to play. I would love it for you to, everybody, you are welcome to unmute yourself because this is a shout out game. And you only get to shout out 2 words. You shout out either the word necessary or you shout out the word unnecessary. So we're going to practice. Everybody say necessary.
Necessary.
Everybody say unnecessary.
Unnecessary.
Very good. So here's the game. We're going to look at committees on boards. Is a governance committee or a committee trustees necessary or unnecessary?
Necessary.
All right, good. Not quite unanimous, but we're a little bit slow there. But yes, absolutely necessary. How about a finance committee or an audit committee?
Necessary.
All right, well done. We got that one. How about a student life or athletics committee?
Unnecessary.
No. Boo. Thumbs down. That's highly operational. Get out. How about a personnel committee?
Unnecessary.
Boo. Thumbs down. Highly operational. How about an executive committee?
Necessary.
This one's a little odd because in a lot of state laws, an executive committee is the only committee that's named, believe it or not. It's just a very peculiar thing. And you really just need to think, what is the function of an executive committee? Is it to act in between meetings? They don't really have to because honestly, this day and age, it's really easy to get people together via Zoom, via phone call, something like that. Or is it to set the agenda? That might have something a little bit of value there. How about this one? Athletics committee.
Unnecessary.
Oh my gosh, you would be talking about cheerleading all the time. If your school has cheerleading, I guarantee your dean of students or your athletic director spends most of their time on that. And don't get me wrong, it's a wonderful sport, absolutely amazing. But I'm telling you, it is one of the third rails. The other third rail is if you ever sitting in a faculty meeting with all the faculty teachers around the room, and you just you're done, and you just need to lob a grenade in there. Bring up dress code. Development committee.
Necessary.
A lot of boards have them. Whether it's necessary or not is interesting. Development, fundraising is something that tends to be kind of an operational thing, but guiding it and leading it, sure, that comes from the board. And most of your boards are comprised of people who have influence in their community and have a lot of friends and maybe have some fun, so they can lead gifts and things. How about a financial aid or scholarship committee?
Necessary.
Unnecessary.
Not a committee. Unnecessary.
Big thumbs down. When you think about the functioning of your financial aid committee, usually it's comprised of like the head of school, the CFO, and the admissions director. That's the most normal way of it. And the idea is these are folks who are reading, these are folks who are actually reading files of folks and actually making decisions whether to take the recommendation of the third party or not to take it and how it might look. And the thing is, if other parents know whether someone's on financial aid or not, it will definitely create a power dynamic that's not fair to either party. So how about a curriculum committee?
Unnecessary.
Unnecessary, and yet you will see this quite a bit in some schools, that the board feels that they really need to need to have ownership over the core mission and the core thing that the school does, which is curriculum. How about a buildings and grounds committee?
Unnecessary.
People go both ways on this. Here's the question: what does the buildings and grounds committee actually have to do?
Capital campaign.
So that's part of fundraising, right?
Yeah.
But a B&G, most of what B&G does is actually look at maintenance issues. And that's kind of an operational issue. Now, this is probably the hardest committee. If your school has a committee, a B&G, a buildings and grounds committee, it would be the hardest committee to get rid of because you've probably brought some people onto the board whose specialty is building. It's that you've got some contractors, some builders things like that. And they are lending their expertise to the board. If you happen to be in a building campaign, I think that's wonderful. But they can help the rest of the board interpret some things. You want to have some lawyers on your board as well who can help the board interpret some things. They're not the school's lawyer, but they might be a lawyer. So they're not allowed, and they shouldn't be giving legal advice no more than someone who's a builder on your board should be giving you building advice, but they can certainly help explain something to the rest of the board so they can make good decisions. How about a strategic planning committee?
Necessary.
Necessary.
See, and I would say, some folks say this is unnecessary because it's one of the primary functions of the board at all times. So you're always in planning mode. You're always in looking at the future and looking at with foresight into what comes next. So I can go either way on this. If you have it, great. And I would say having it as a standing committee reminds you how important it is. How about a head of school committee?
Unnecessary.
In a search.
Yeah. People normally say the only time we need a head of school committee is when we are in search. And I would say you probably need a head of school committee to support the head. So you'll see head support and evaluation committee a lot, and that's from a particular consultancy that's told schools to do an HSEC committee. I think you can't do both support and evaluation. You should sort of choose which one you want to do. You can if the evaluation is very formative in nature, but a lot of times it tends not to be. So I'll skip and show you this. These are just the percentages of schools that have these particular committees. So in a study, just says, do you have this committee, yes or no? So you can see almost every school has a finance or audit committee. Almost every school has a development committee and an executive committee, B&G. Head of school committee is the most popular one after that. Very quickly, some things that schools do. And so the reason I'm going to be quick is because you've got these slides, and I just want to show you how to read them. How frequently does your board meet? Some meet 10 or more times a year. I can't imagine that meeting that many times a year, but plenty do. So monthly meeting or something like that. Quarterly meetings are great. Is there a magic number, a right number? Actually, what's right for your school is what you should do. Most governance wonks would say, if you have too many meetings, you've invited your families into the day-to-day operations of the school. And I understand that, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. So fewer meetings that help the board remain focused on their strategic long-term vision of the school is really a good thing. I know that most schools since March have had more board meetings this spring than they ever planned to before. And I'm actually very interested from a research perspective and from a support perspective to understand pre-COVID boards, post-COVID boards. How do you actually help your board get to a post-COVID mindset where they don't have to be as heavily involved in some of the monumental decisions about the school's future as they feel like they've had to be in the last 3 to 4 months? I actually think that's going to be a pretty significant issue that schools will face in about 12 to 18 months or so. Next is terms of service of boards. The most common is a 3-year term of service. I've got this question: do you happen to know what it is for your school? If you do, good for you. And if you don't, it's something for you to go and investigate. Term limits. Some schools have limits to how long people can serve on the board. How do you get onto the board? The most common way is what's called a self-perpetuating board, meaning the members of the board themselves are the ones to vote on who comes onto the board. And most would say that, or a nominating committee of the board that elects it, are the two in independent school that are the best practice. The others are not a good practice. A parental vote is probably the worst practice you can possibly have. And we've definitely come across schools that have a parent vote for board members. And it's a really old holdover from wanting to look like public school, wanting to look like a governance model that is something that they weren't fully familiar with when they were founded as a board. So schools that were kind of immature and founded in the South, especially from 1965 to 1975, in that era, tend to need to get beyond their founding to something new. How often is your board? This is Mike's type, so I won't go through it, but do a variety of different things here. Minimum suggested contribution for board members. If nothing else, this slide is powerful to indicate to board members some schools actually do have a minimum suggested contribution, and they name it. I'm serving on a board right now, and they told me before I came on, we have a suggested contribution. And I said, I'm not a parent in this school. I'm a community member. I'm an outsider. Are you sure you want that to apply to me? And they said, no, not really. I said, okay, that's fine. Thank you for that. And this final little piece of data here is what role the head of school has on the board. It would be incredibly rare for anybody else outside of the head of school to have a role on the board. The vast majority here, this 588, the red one, is that they're an ex officio member of the board. What that means is because of the office they hold, because they are head of school, they're on the board. It does not imply that they have a vote. It does not imply that they don't have a vote. All it says is that they're on the board because of the office they hold. The bylaws actually should be specific and actually should say if the head of school has a vote or doesn't have a vote. The most common is this one, ex officio, most commonly means that they don't have a vote. But your bylaws should actually specify it. Otherwise, again, from a wonkish governance point of view, if they're on the board, they have a vote. There are so many different governance models here. And I've got a little asterisk by the ones that are most common in independent schools. And your board probably follows a traditional model. Carver model is a policy model that came onto the scene in independent schools. Actually, a lot of Christian schools were the ones that adopted it. I am positive there was a consultant working in the through the late 70s and mid 80s who really beat the drum of the Carver model. And so you'll see this pretty frequently in a lot of Christian schools. It's, like I said, it's a policy model that's set up to say, or a limitation model. So it basically says, this is what you can't do. And so the opposite of that would be what you can do. It's a pretty interesting model. So let me slide into this here, this characteristics of healthy boards. 3 really easy things to wrap your mind around. 3 things the board should do: set the mission and exercise cultural oversight, fund and perpetuate it with vision oversight for the future, and through the head of school, really focus on operational oversight. So these are 3 main ways the boards operate, and I have a question for you. Which oversight do most boards spend most of their time engaged in? Which of these 3?
Operational.
I hear operational. Anyone want to challenge operational? Yeah, operational. Yeah, do you know why? Because it's the easiest.
Mm-hmm.
It's what you can see. You can't see culture. You can't see the future, not nearly as well as you can the operations in the day-to-day. This is the hardest thing for boards to break out of. And I'll give you a phrase that you can use here. Since boards spend most of their time on operational oversight, they lead by snoopervising, with committees that are centered on operations rather than on good governance for the future. So here's some duties and responsibilities of the board. Duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience are bound to be written into your state code somewhere. They're the really common. And these are the 3 that really refer to the legal responsibilities of boards. Duty of foresight is something that's come on the scene by a consultant who's working in our space, Jeff DeCania, who's really the dean of foresight. And another organization that we work with quite a bit, the American Society of Association Executives, has a whole module on foresight. My own board, the MSBO board, Lee, the MSBO board is going to be working with some foresight. Actually, hopefully you've seen the video because we've got a board meeting next week, and I sent a video on foresight around to my board. But some responsibilities. This is 6 really easy responsibilities. Advocate for the school, be strategic, adhere strictly to separation, maintain confidentiality, prepare thoroughly, and fulfill your fiduciary obligations. So, so that you will see and be able to refer back to these. Each of these has its own slide: the duty of care slide, duty of loyalty slide, duty of obedience slide, duty of foresight slide, and then the 6 responsibilities. And the 6 responsibilities, this is a cheat sheet here, statements that actually refer to each of these 6 responsibilities. It's pretty easy to take these statements and generate a workable board evaluation based around them. These are the traits and habits and characteristics that we want to encourage. So let's assess what we want to actually see happen. Final participation here. A member of the Finance Committee comes to see you to talk about the school's insurance. He's a new board member and he claims that his agency could provide better rates. He wants you to advocate for his agency at the next committee meeting and board meeting. What are you going to do? Just breathe a second and think. Just think. Who wants to respond to this? Julie.
It presents a conflict of interest and it disengages him from that conversation in the board meetings.
This happens all the time. Whether he's an insurance agent, whether or she is an insurance agent or a builder or a lender or a lawyer, anything like that, where people get on the board because they want to steer some business towards their own firm. An absolute conflict of interest, and it should be avoided at all costs. But you might have some deep relationships with some parents, whether they're board members or not, who are parents in your school, and will say, you know what, I'll give you a great rate on insurance, on your casualty, on your property. You don't see it on medical quite as much, but you will see it on casualty and property, occasionally D&O, but D&O is really inexpensive. But it's the others that you'll see where, hey, I can get you a great rate on this. And then they think, because I've given you a great rate on this, that is my contribution to the school. I don't actually have to donate funds, money as well. And how come my name isn't in the donor list here as having donated X amount to the school? Well, those weren't the treasures that we were looking for. We appreciate your talent and we appreciate your time. That's not the treasure that we need at the moment. This is a pretty significant trap that's really easy to fall into. And the tough thing is, I think actually as Julie just presented it in a pretty good way, she presented it through, I would call that an empathetic lens, to say, this is going to disengage you from the rest of the board conversation. And you're on the board because we want to hear your voice and things. But this one isn't going to serve you well or the school well. Let's talk about how we can actually do this in a way that works and avoids this conflict of interest. I've written down here when Aaron said it, lead with empathy. I've got a whiteboard here, which is wonderful. So I write on it all the time. But leading with empathy is one of the characteristics, I think, that is an influence skill that is probably as significant as any other. And seeing things through the lens of someone else, how they'll experience something, how they will hear you, how they will be listened to by you, as Aaron said, and as I think we've repeated throughout this workshop, is a pretty key skill. A couple things here, landmines and gold mines. We'll share this link with you and link it from your own page, but this page, misbo.com/rockon, landmines, gold mines, you get it. All right. Is a list of some resources designed for the CFO and the business officer. That's a growing list of just general resources that we keep throwing into this site. I know that I'm going to turn this back over to Diane momentarily, but I want you to know that you are ready. I just hope your school is ready for you.